Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm again joined by Caleb Maupin. Now, I had you on about 8 months ago, Caleb, to talk about your book, How BreadTube Serves Imperialism. That came out in June of last year, roughly 8 months before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And boy, were you right. Looking at BreadTube Twitter, BreadTube U videos, it almost is surreal. I think one of the best expressions of this is a few months ago when Vosh tweeted anarcho-NATOism. I don't think anybody could have ever thought that was going to be a thing. So what was your key insight that allowed you to see that these people would just line up behind World War III?
Well, I mean, I think that was apparent to anyone who paid attention to how their politics was going. The fact that they were attacking anti-war voices like Jimmy Dore, like Jackson Hinkle, like myself. The fact that they were trying their hardest to make socialism supportive of regime change operations. It seemed like when there was a big moment like this is the direction they would move in. But that said, I mean, as I laid out in the book, I got information about who was advising them. And that led me to put forward the thesis in my book, which was this was a maneuver by one section of the ruling class, one section of the deep state against another. And now we have even further information. Gray Zone has revealed that Abigail Thorne, the founder of Philosophy Tube, was being subsidized by a foundation that was key in funding the Syrian rebel terrorists fighting the Syrian government, and is connected with the British royal family and USAID and British intelligence. So there's a direct link between BreadTube, or what you can call BreadTube, and the American or British intelligence community that's been established. And then the way they've conducted themselves since the intervention, in the situation in Ukraine. Ever since then, they have completely revealed themselves to be the biggest war hawks possible. They're fundraising like crazy. They're cheering for the Azov battalion. And it's pretty wild because these are the same people that have been calling people Nazis for nonstop since Trump got elected. Since 2016, it's been Nazi, 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 Nazi. There's even a chapter in my book, BreadTube Serves Imperialism, called Nazi, Nazi, Nazi. And I just talk about how these people, their whole worldview consists around there are good people and bad people. The good people are people who agree with them, and the bad people are called Nazis. And everyone who disagrees with them in one way or another is somehow a Nazi. That's their whole worldview. But yet now we have a situation where in Ukraine, there's an actual group of Nazis called the Azov Battalion that are so important to the Ukrainian President Zelensky. He actually brought one of them to the Greek parliament recently. I don't know if you saw that. And there's been outrage in Greece, even among people who support Ukraine and support Zelensky, about the fact that he brought an actual Nazi fighter of the Azov Battalion to the Greek parliament with him. That's how important they are. And there's actual Nazis getting guns from the United States, and these people support it. And it just reveals how selective they are. They have no real political agenda. They are simply there to frame support for U.S. foreign policy in leftist terms. And what I wrote in my book has been confirmed as absolutely right. And it's funny because you would think that they would kind of try to back away from it, but they just continue. They continue their hysteria against me. Now, Jimmy Dore recently did a segment with me highlighting the book. The book has been selling quite a bit. And many more people have been saying, wow, I used to think that there was maybe truth on both sides between you and BreadTube, but now they have just completely become shills for the Pentagon. And I see you were right all along, Caleb. So, I see what's happening in the world. It's certainly not good, but it is a case of me saying, I told you so. So there you go.
Well, you brought up Zelensky and Azov. Well, there was a recent video by Jimmy Dore where the ADL is now apparently defending Azov, or at least members of the ADL. Again, who could have envisioned that? I think another related issue here is what happened to Russia Today America and Russia Today YouTube. Imagine in 2003 or 4, the Bush administration canceling Al Jazeera. We can't imagine that because that didn't happen. But now we're canceling Russian, affiliated or whatever, a media source that is sympathetic to the Russians. And this is just completely unprecedented. Do you have anything to say about that?
Well, there was an FBI raid on the offices of Al Jazeera America. That did happen. I believe Bush was president when that happened. Now, they didn't get shut down. They continued to broadcast. And ultimately, Al Jazeera America stopped functioning. The Qatari government just stopped really paying for it. I mean, Al Jazeera was so in line with U.S. foreign policy towards the end of the Obama administration that it really had no reason to function. And so Al Jazeera America just kind of stopped functioning. They have AJ Plus online at this point. Al Jazeera represents the Qatari monarchy. There's also some Turkish money in there, and it represents one faction in the Middle East that you can call the Muslim Brotherhood, right? You have Wahhabis that's come out of Saudi Arabia. That's, the very extreme, wing of Sunni Islam that wants a very, very traditional, Islamic government, something like the 1400s, an absolute monarchy, etc. And then you have Shia Islam, which is, that's Iran and its allies, the axis of resistance. And then you have this kind of third pole within Islam in the Middle East that is the Muslim Brotherhood. And it's represented primarily by Turkey and Qatar. They believe in, more modern, technology. They believe in elected governments. They really believe strongly in free markets, but they are very anti-Israel. And they have kind of their own unique perspective. And the Obama administration worked really, really hard to use the Muslim Brotherhood and Al Jazeera and their allies, the allies of Turkey, the allies of Qatar, as kind of proxies in the Middle East. And Trump went out of his way to kind of offend those folks. So that's kind of a long answer about what's going on there. But yeah, RT America is no longer in existence. Me and all the other employees of RT America received a layoff letter. Now I'm still doing work with RT International from home, but I don't have a cameraman, and I hope I end up getting paid. And it's not a good situation. It's not a good situation at all. RT, I'm very loyal to RT and everything that we do there. I think RT is really important and it's a valuable voice, but the powers that be have worked really, really hard to make it almost impossible for us to function. And it's particularly outrageous. And again, if they weren't using left themes to do it, they wouldn't have gotten away with this. During the Bush years, there was a lot of jingoism, the idea that, anyone who is critical of Bush or shows any sympathy for Muslims or criticism of Israel is a terrorist. But there were some people that kind of in their guts knew that was wrong. And by framing it in that way, like, you're a bunch of Arabs, moved to another country, terror, there were a lot of people that in their guts felt like something was wrong with that. And so there was pushback against that. Maybe not as quickly as some people would have liked, but there was pushback against it. But now they're framing this cancellation of all things associated with Russia, banning Anastasia, banning Tchaikovsky, they're banning Russian cats from international cat shows.
Tolstoy, even Tolstoy.
Tolstoy. They're framing all of that not in right-wing jingoistic terms of, these are a bunch of foreigners and they're commies, traitors to the homeland. Not framing it that way. They're framing it as the latest moral cause. Don't you care about those poor Ukrainians who are dying? Don't you care about them? If you're a bad person, they're framing it in this kind of liberal cancel culture tone. When the reality is that it's all hypocrisy, because the way the United States has been responding to the Ukraine crisis has been pouring more and more weapons into the country. It's now been revealed that the United States has had CIA forces in Ukraine for at least 5 years, at least half a decade, preparing and training people for a long-term war. If you care about the people of the country, you don't plan to turn their country into a battlefield. You would plan a negotiation so that this would end. And, Russia is responding to 8 years of shelling of Donetsk and Lugansk. It's responding to 8 years of ignoring the Minsk Accords, the Minsk Agreement that was supposed to de-escalate tension in the country ever since the 2014 coup that toppled the government. They are responding to more and more weapons being piled into Kiev and threatening them on their border. They're responding to Kiev talking about getting nuclear weapons. And now we know another factor that Russia didn't even mention prior to this because of the history of weapons of mass destruction and all of that. But we know that there were biolabs, that there were biological research facilities funded by the Pentagon that it appears, the Pentagon, of course, denies this, but it appears were connected with engaging in the research of biological weapons. And they've already had a detrimental health effect on the people living there. There were these biolabs in Ukraine. Now, could you imagine if in Mexico, the Russian government, toppled the Mexican government, installed a very anti-American regime there, started arming neo-Nazi gangs, and then on top of that was building, biological weapons facilities in Mexico. The United States wouldn't stand for that. They would respond. Well, Russia has showed quite a bit of restraint over the past 8 years. They have waited and they have waited and they have waited for the Minsk Accords to be, fulfilled and recognizing the rights of the Russian-speaking people in the eastern regions. That hasn't happened. There's been 8 years of bombing and shelling, 14,000 people dead. And at this point, Russia's saying, look, this has gone too far, and they are responding. I hope this war ends as soon as possible. I don't want to see Ukrainians die. I don't want to see Ukrainians suffer. But when liberals say they care about Ukraine, I'm sorry, the actions of the United States for the past 8 years don't indicate concern for Ukraine. They indicate a desire to hurt Russia by drawing Russia into a long-term, decades-long conflict in the country.
Yes, and recently Chris Hedges got RT'd. He got kicked off YouTube. And what's interesting, he was also on Jimmy Dore recently, and he was saying that one of the things that you are not allowed to talk about are the underlying economic problems that are causing all the social dislocation that these more identity politics oriented movements are capitalizing on. And he says, well, him and Jimmy were saying that's not going to actually help solve the problems that those people are dealing with at that level. And it's also interesting that this process, which began in 2017, going after far right types after Charlottesville, has within only 5 years gone after progressive pundits who've been around for 40 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty wild. What I think is particularly amusing is that a number of the Charlottesville voices, these Nazis, are in agreement with BreadTube. Richard Spencer has been desperately trying to get me to tweet back at him on social media. He's cheering for Ukraine against Russia. I believe there's another prominent white nationalist individual. What is it, Greg something? He's also saying that. And among white nationalists, we were told white nationalism was a big Russian conspiracy, right? It was all just a big Russian conspiracy. Putin was paying Nazis to support Trump and create a crisis in America. Now it seems like many of the most prominent voices within white nationalism are taking the exact same position as the Antifa forces. I mean, it's just particularly wild to see. And it really kind of points to the fact that it's like, at this point, it's not really a question of left versus right in the United States. It's a question of compromised versus uncompromised. Because at the end of the day, on the far left and on the far right, there are some forces that are compromised. And on the far left and the far right, there are some voices that are not. And those who are not compromised get marginalized, get threatened, get, social media campaigns against them. And those that are compromised get promoted to be the voice of their respective movements. And that's really just how simple it is. And we're seeing this play out on the far left and on the far right. And that there are people in the far right camp who agree with Vosh 100% on foreign policy. And there are people in the far left camp who don't. And that's really how all of this gets down to. And that one common theme I've noticed among the forces that seem to be compromised and seem to be taking the NATO position is that they are obsessed with identity and not economics, right? You listen to Stefan Molyneux, basically, and I debated Stefan Molyneux. You can listen to the debate that I had with him. And in the lead up to that debate, I listened to a lot of his recordings. He's doing exactly what the woke left does. He comes out of a psychoanalytic background. I believe his wife is a Freudian psychoanalyst, if I'm not mistaken. And he talks in this very gentle voice, and he talks about the pain that young men have experienced, the abuse they may have experienced growing up, the problems that they're having in relationships, women breaking their hearts, etc. And he tells them, no one understands you. The world is not recognizing your pain because you're white. Well, if you look at what the woke left does, it's a very similar thing. Now, obviously, they're talking about centuries of oppression and discrimination and things that are much more serious than instances of an abusive parent or relationships gone bad. But it's the same kind of thing. We hear your pain. We give you permission to be angry about the hardships that you've experienced, and it's because of your racial identity. And we're going to stoke your emotions around that. We're going to give you permission to unleash your rage. None of this is serious politics. This is just an emotional manipulation and an emotional game, right? Serious politics is about policy and implementing solutions that will actually improve people's lives and telling people the world is unfair to you because of your identity, and telling people the world doesn't understand you because of your identity, giving people the opportunity to explore their emotional pain and get mad about hard things that have happened in life and develop resentment around it. That is not real politics. That is simply a psychological game, and it gives people something to do, especially during a pandemic when a lot of people have been on lockdown and they just have time to just sit around the house. Sure, you can stew on your emotional hardships. You can, let your resentments ride. But at the end of the day, nothing really changes. Changes come from real policy solutions. And the compromised wings of the left and the right, neither of them are offering real policy solutions to improve people's lives. They're offering people permission to feel their emotions. It's very much a libidinal kind of release. It's similar to what I wrote about in my book on Kamala Harris.
Now, with regards to the sanctions against Russia and then Russian personnel and Russian affiliated people, do you see any possibility of sanctions against employees of Russian affiliated media?
Well, generally, the way sanctions work is they don't impose them on U.S. citizens. I mean, there are, I mean, I know like the head of RT, or Ria Novosti, the parent company of RT. She's been, she's faced harassment. I mean, you can look up the specifics. I don't want to get into specifics. I don't want to get it wrong, but you can look at how, I mean, there have been some attempts in the United States. Courts have wanted her, et cetera. And that, there is certainly that possibility, but the way sanctions work is they don't impose them on U.S. citizens. And the reason for that, and this is very interesting, is because sanctions are completely unconstitutional. In the United States, we generally have this thing called the right to due process, right? Which is, if someone is going to accuse you of something and punish you for it, you have the right to go to court and defend yourself. But the way sanctions are imposed, the State Department just declares, well, these individuals we think are involved with something we don't like, so they're guilty until proven innocent. They're immediately declared it without due process, and they're just completely canceled. And on top of that, sanctions are generally, not passed by Congress, but they are in effect laws, right? It's a federal law, basically. You can't do business with these people. That only applies to individuals, right? You can't do that. You can't have a law that specifically applies to individuals. You can have a law that applies to certain demographics or certain policies, but you can't say, Congress can't pass a law that only applies to Joe Bob. That's not allowed. That's always been understood. Laws are for groups, laws are for societies, they're not for individuals. So we have laws that are specific to individuals. We have individuals being declared guilty of crimes when, they don't have an opportunity to defend themselves ever. And so as of the moment, they haven't sanctioned individual U.S. citizens yet, because they would have to then take it to court, and it would probably be struck down. A court would say, no, you can't declare someone guilty of something and impose, federal penalties on them and their ability to do business. You can't do that, without giving them due process. So I think it's unlikely we're going to see sanctions on specific individuals. But yes, foreign entities, foreign companies. I mean, there's all kinds of Russians that can never come to the United States. There's all kinds of Russians who've been indicted from the United States. There's all kinds of Russian businesses that are not able to do business in the United States. And the way these sanctions work is particularly ridiculous and outrageous. Some of them are passed as national security, proposals, which makes them even more outrageous. The president can impose sanctions by declaring there's a national security threat. I mean, the U.S. has sanctions on Belarus and Zimbabwe and other countries, declaring that they're national security threats. That's utterly ridiculous. It has nothing to do with our security. It's simply a mechanism for waging economic warfare against countries.
So obviously, while BreadTube wasn't provoking the war in Ukraine, to what extent would you say that BreadTube is a efficient cause for accelerating pro-Western, anti-Russian, militarist, jingoist sentiment?
I think that BreadTube, this war would be happening with or without BreadTube. Young Turks and some of the bigger, so-called progressive voices are a little bit more to blame. I see BreadTube it's not like they're responsible for it. I think that what's going on is that there is a widespread interest in socialism and Marxism and anarchism and radical ideas among younger Americans. Zoomers and younger millennials are very interested in these topics. And if young people were getting interested in those topics and studying genuine Marxism, genuine anarchism, genuine socialism, they would come to anti-war conclusions. Emma Goldman, she was one of the most anarchist voices in U.S. history and almost one of the most anti-war. Read her essay on preparedness, the road to universal slaughter. Look at Eugene Debs and his history. He was put in prison for anti-war speeches that he gave. And if you study genuine socialism and genuine Marxism, you're going to come to anti-war and anti-imperialist conclusions. And you're going to say our enemy is not in Russia. It's not in China. It's not in Iran or Venezuela. Our enemy's on Wall Street and our enemy's in Washington, D.C. That's pretty basic, right? That's pretty basic. But BreadTube is there so that when young people get interested in socialism and they start investigating this stuff, they don't go and read Debs. They don't get into this kind of perspective, the kind of perspective that's defined leftist politics. Instead, they get into Vosh or Thought Slime or ContraPoints, and they get into a weird distortion of these politics that enables them to support U.S. foreign policy. So I see BreadTube as being almost kind of they're a manipulation. They're there to make sure that we don't have the all kinds of young people that were excited by Bernie Sanders, to make sure they don't all become anti-war activists, to make sure they all don't become opponents of NATO. It's more intervention and manipulation of people who could be taking better positions, but it's a manipulation to make sure they don't.
So one of the interesting things as well that is a parallel to BreadTube is that there's been a lot of progressive voices which were strongly anti-war during the war on terror, Iraq, Afghanistan, and have now completely switched their tune. So do you have any thought? We're not talking about young people that don't remember. And so, well, you might say, well, they're going to be this way because they don't remember the Iraq war. They don't remember the war in Afghanistan. But there are people that were around since Vietnam that have completely flipped from far, left anti-war types to complete hawks. Do you have any explanation? What do you think is the cause for this change?
There's twofold. The first thing is that you have to remember that Europe and the NATO countries were largely opposed to the invasion of Iraq. France, Germany, Italy, countries like that didn't support the invasion. Britain did, but for the most part, most of the major NATO countries were against U.S. intervention in Iraq. And so a lot of leftist voices in the United States are more close to Europe. People often talk about how the New York Times seems to almost be the voice of European capital as opposed to the voice of American capital. So, a lot of these people like Sean Penn, and I'm trying to think of some other big names, a lot of them are people that, are more in line with Europe. And Europe was, in the French government was very blatantly opposed to the Iraq War. Jacques Chirac, and you remember Michael Moore, he got the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival for his Fahrenheit 9/11 film against Bush. And a lot of this was that European capital was not on board with Bush's invasion of Iraq, which was done unilaterally, which the UN Security Council opposed, etc. So that's one factor. The second factor is, and this is very interesting, is that the role of the U.S. left in the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a divide in the Soviet Communist Party. There were two factions. Officially, the Soviet Communist Party, they had democratic centralism. They were all on the same page. But beneath the surface, everybody knows there were hardliners and moderates. And both the hardliners and the moderates were straying from Marxism. The hardliners were becoming more traditionalist and more Russian nationalistic, more orthodox, religious, and more czaristic. Alexander Dugin kind of represents kind of a continuation of where a lot of the hardliners in the Soviet Communist Party were going. A lot of the folks in the KGB and a lot of the more traditional folks who admired Stalin, they were straying from Marxism and going into this kind of Russian traditionalist conservative that was anti-capitalist and anti-Western, but also somewhat right-wing. And then among the moderates, a lot of them were not believing in Marxism. A lot of the forces that eventually rallied around Gorbachev, and they were believing in social democracy, identity politics, the synthetic left, hippie counterculture, pacifism, etc. And a lot of the role of the American synthetic left and the American Marxist movement, academics, people like Angela Davis and others, was to prop up the Gorbachev wing of the Soviet Communist Party. They would go over there and say, America's your friend. Reagan is bad, but, there's people like Bernie Sanders and Mike Dukakis who really like you and are not a threat to you. And there was a feeling among the Gorbachev wing of the Soviet Communist Party that if the Soviet Union dissolved, the United States and would just kind of allow them to transition to being a social democratic welfare state like Norway or Sweden. They'd have more human rights. They'd have more freedom. They'd keep their guaranteed jobs, keep their guaranteed health care, but also be able to shop at Walmart and listen to Beatles music and wear blue jeans. And the American left was largely a part of that covert manipulation. Bernie Sanders went over to the Soviet Union. That was, during the 2020 elections, there was all these files that got dumped about Bernie's role in the Soviet Union in the 80s. And there were joint anti-nuclear marches in the USA and the Soviet Union and the anti-nuclear power and anti-nuclear weapons movement. And the U.S. Marxist left that was more pro-Soviet than the Reagan people were, they were playing a role. They were propping up the Gorbachev reformist wing that ultimately surrendered and dissolved the Soviet Union. Well, Putin is very much a repudiation of those folks. Putin's rise to power is very much a statement that Gorbachev sold out, the Soviet Union, that the illusions of that reformist wing of the Soviet bureaucracy that thought they would be allowed to become just a more liberal European social democracy, that they were betrayed and they were, destroyed economically and demolished afterwards. Putin is very much seen as a repudiation of the forces that the liberals were aligned with in Eastern Europe. And because of that, they don't have sympathy for him the same way they might have had sympathy for Gorbachev or even Brezhnev, right? They see Putin as a very, very dangerous repudiation of everything that we're about. For example, one incident that happened in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union was, the Soviet Union had fallen. All these countries in Eastern Europe had abandoned Marxism and socialism. So the Communist Party of the United States, they had a big convention that happened. They had a very big convention. And at that convention, a whole lot of the membership resigned. Gus Hall stayed strong and stayed loyal to the party, but Angela Davis and a whole bunch of academics and all kinds of college professors and people that had been in the Soviet-aligned Communist Party quit, and they formed something called the Committees of Correspondence that basically denounced Marxism. And they kind of represented this kind of liberal wing that had helped bring down the Soviet Union, not with threats of military interventionism, but with ideological penetration, delusion, and filling the Soviet bureaucracy with the illusion that the United States wasn't going to destroy them and demolish them. Another event that's kind of key is, in 1993, as Boris Yeltsin was presiding over the economic demolition of the Soviet Union and just taking Russia, selling all the assets off the highest bidder, the country was getting poorer and poorer and poorer. The Russian people voted for a parliament that was going to stop economic austerity. And it was the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, and it was the the National Salvation Front that was kind of the coalition. You had some right-wing parties. And then Boris Yeltsin used his presidential power to dissolve the parliament. And what was the term he used when he dissolved the parliament? He called it a red-brown alliance. And that's where the term red-brown alliance comes from. It was the slur that Boris Yeltsin used to justify shutting down the elected anti-austerity parliament. But among leftists in the United States, the memo got sent out. Don't protest what Boris Yeltsin is doing. Don't protest in support of the Russian parliament that is standing up to austerity, because if you do, you're supporting anti-Semitism, you're supporting fascism, you're supporting a red-brown alliance. And so the U.S. left that generally, I mean, if you saw a communist get elected and then the parliament get dissolved, I mean, and it escalated to a bloodbath in the streets. They call it Black September. 187 people were killed. The communist and nationalist members of parliament refused to abandon the parliament building. Boris Yeltsin's forces shelled the parliament and opened fire on it. People died. It was a horrendous episode of death and fighting in the streets as austerity and the economic demolition of the Soviet Union moved ahead. And the Western left was largely silent on it. And they were silent on it because they had been told that this coalition, the Russian Communist Party and Russian nationalist groups, they were a red-brown alliance. And again, a lot of the forces on the left existed in alliance with the Gorbachev wing of the Communist Party that ultimately brought down the Soviet Union. So that's why ultimately a lot of them just really are vehemently opposed to Putin, because he's very much a repudiation of the forces that they brought in there. He's kind of a revival of that hardliner wing of the Soviet Communist Party that was straying from Marxism and was going to more traditionalist and conservative ideas, but was doing so in a repudiation of the West. And they don't have any sympathy for him, and they were kind of working against the kind of people he was aligned with even before the Soviet Union fell.
All right. Now, if we look at the political left in the United States, you've got, of course, the movement that you're currently affiliated with, CPI, which is a more robust, workers-oriented group. We have, of course, BreadTube, which is online. We have, of course, the Young Turks. We have, of course, the main news, quote-unquote, left news outlets. And we have now an increasingly large group of what we might call politically homeless people like Chris Hedges, people like Glenn Greenwald. So how do you see the left in the United States and all of these different fragmented, quarreling pieces sorting themselves out over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, that's a very good question. I'm starting to wonder, one prediction that has been made, and again, I have no crystal ball, I have no way of seeing this, is some have argued that the Republican Party may become a kind of catch-all populist anti-establishment party, and the Democratic Party will increasingly become the party of simply defending the status quo. We've seen a lot of the neocons of the Bush years go back into the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has basically forgiven and, rehabilitated George W. Bush. And Bill Kristol is now supporting the Democrats, and FBI Director James Comey, fired by Trump, is now supporting the Democrats. And it seems like a lot of longtime Republicans are supporting the Democrats at this point. And the Republican Party is associated with people that have questions about the lockdowns, people that are opposing vaccine mandates, people that are, not excited about Joe Biden's war with Russia, populist concerns about the rising price of fuel. And that even though the Republican Party, yes, being opposed to communism and believing in free markets seems to be very important to a lot of those folks, increasingly you find a lot of people in the Republican Party that are just mad at the status quo and are voting for the Republicans because they see them as the party that is mad at the status quo. Donald Trump got a lot of votes from Black and Latino folks, more than any other Republican candidate for president in history, I believe. Minister Louis Farrakhan, it was reported widely that he'd endorsed Donald Trump. Now, it was not true. They clarified that he was not endorsing Trump. But Minister Louis Farrakhan sat down with Alex Jones and said very positive things about Donald Trump during the campaign. And there were a lot of Black nationalists who supported Donald Trump based on the fact that Hillary Clinton had murdered Gaddafi. Farrakhan was going around the country in 2016 saying that Hillary Clinton was a wicked woman. And so you have a situation where, and it's also important, I guess, before I move on, to point out that the highest percentage of people that are unvaccinated of any race is African Americans. And that political alignment in the United States may shift towards having the Republican Party be a catch-all populist party of Bernie Sanders types, Donald Trump types, and everything in between. And the Democrats become just the party of the status quo. What is interesting is that I think that there's a class dynamic to this, and that it really kind of it reflects the fact that basically the Democrats are the party of urban political machines. They've been that since the beginning, really. And in the urban areas in the United States, you have white middle class people, and you have low income people of color. And the Republicans are the party of rural folks. They've always been that, and except for in the South until after the rise of the Civil Rights Movement, Republicans started to win in the South. But the Republicans have always been a rural party since the time of Abraham Lincoln and the small farmers. So it tends to be at this point that low-income white people vote for the Republican Party, low-income Black people vote for the Democratic Party, wealthy middle-class urban white people vote for the Democratic Party, and rural wealthy folks that maybe they aren't in with Wall Street, but they own a hotel chain or they own a fracking company, they vote for the Republican Party. And it seems like that's how politics is lining up. It's rural versus urban, essentially. But low-income white people are starting to realize that they have a lot more in common with low-income Black people than they do with upper middle-class white people in the urban centers, or with wealthy fracking company owners or hotel chain owners who happen to also vote Republican. And in some ways, populism, the idea that we're for the people against the elite, populist values can translate over racial lines. And conspiracy theories, right? Talk about the Illuminati and the reptilians and the thing high up on the thing and all of that. That's been popular in the Black community for years. Books like Behold a Pale Horse are widely studied, but now those books are very popular in the white community as well. You have white people talking about the Illuminati. You have white people talking about the Vatican or about the Freemasons or something like that. And populist sentiments are becoming pretty common among all sectors of the working class. Whereas defense of the establishment and the belief that we need to suppress quote unquote conspiracy theories, we need to suppress dissident thought, we need to mandate that people get vaccinated, that's becoming popular among Republican and Democratic sections of the middle class. So I'm seeing a class divide approaching that will kind of redefine demographics in U.S. society. It will take a long time, though, and I think a lot of it is just generational. I think that red state folks that are older and are in the Trump camp, I don't see them ever voting for somebody who's like Bernie Sanders. The anti-communism and the conservatism is just really built in. But you have to remember, those folks aren't going to be alive forever. And over the course of the next several decades, there may be a very interesting realignment in the United States. And that alignment, may change, and the values of it may change as the Cold War generation kind of dies off. Memories of the Cold War and the rhetoric of the Cold War kind of fades from people's memories. The loyalty of the right wing to free markets may go away. The loyalty of the left wing to culture wars may also fade away. And the fact that the Medicare for All marches that were so widely promoted by Jimmy Dore were just so viciously attacked by the establishment left. They were telling people, don't go to the Medicare for All marches. It's a red-brown alliance. That shows how threatening economic and actual class struggle politics is to the establishment left.
Now, one of the things that's sort of been a subtext to our conversation is just the fact that there's so much contradictions in modern politics. So you'll have like liberals and Jews supporting the Ukraine and the Nazis fighting in the Ukraine, which who could have ever seen that, right? And then you'll see Democrats who've been, anti-imperialists completely becoming the hawks. And then you've seen Republican voters who were previously hawkish in Iraq now becoming anti-interventionist. There was that recent vote on NATO where I think like 69 Republican senators or who were MAGA supporters voted against it. So what is causing all of this contradiction? It just seems like nothing seems to make sense anymore. Nothing seems to have a fixed point from which you can reason out to some conclusion.
Well, this is why Marxist materialism is so important. If you're going to look for the answer in terms of ideology, it's not going to make sense, right? I mean, it's not going to make sense. Why are Jews so supportive of the Azov battalion that's tearing down World War II memorials and thinks that the Nazis were right in World War II? Why are hard right conservatives more critical of the war and more critical of the military-industrial complex than liberals? It doesn't make any sense unless you look at the economic base, which is that there's a divide in the United States between the ultra-rich capitalists, the big oil companies, the Silicon Valley monopolists, the intelligence apparatus, the folks at the Ford Foundation, the folks at the Rockefeller think tanks, George Soros. The higher levels of capital have a much more global outlook, and they are looking to dominate the global economy for Wall Street, and they're not as concerned about the domestic economy of the United States. Whereas a lot of lower level capitalists, that are more domestically focused and are more concerned about making money here in the United States, are not as concerned globally about beating back Russia or beating back China. They just want to continue making money and grow. And right now, those folks tend to have a more libertarian perspective because they realize that, that if someone's going to write the rules, it's going to be the ultra rich capitalists. And the ultra rich capitalists have a more managerial perspective. They're into social engineering and trying to kind of stabilize and control U.S. society so that they can stay on top and there's not any great big upheavals. But that divide between big capital and little capital is really underlying a lot of this. And this is a long-standing divide in U.S. politics. Roosevelt, very much, he was aligned with the Rockefellers, but he was against the National Association of Manufacturers, Henry Ford, Henry Morgan, people like that. McCarthyism, the reason that it was eventually, shut down, and you had mainstream media shut down and go after Joe McCarthy, was the middle class, small business owner types were using McCarthyism to go after wealthy capitalists. The John Birch Society was saying the Rockefellers were communists. The U.S. Army was being investigated for potential communist ties. And so McCarthyism, even though it started out as just kind of a defense of the establishment against communism, it eventually turned into this weird middle class uprising against some of the wealthiest people in the United States. So they had to shut it down. And I think that's what we're seeing here. And that's what's underlying this. Lower level capitalists are not concerned about dominating the world for Wall Street, about paying more for gas because it's going to help Ukraine. Whereas the ultra monopolists are thinking long term and trying to strategically beat back any competition and trying to stabilize U.S. society with more controlling measures. And so they are much more sympathetic to what Joe Biden's doing.
Yes. Now, from what would you say Russia's perspective is? Because we hear a lot about what America's perspective is in the mainstream media. We hear a lot about Europe's perspective, but what is at stake for Russia in the Ukraine, and what does Russia want in the Ukraine?
Well, I don't represent Russia. I'm an American. I don't speak Russian. No one in my family's Russian. I'm an Irish American. I work at Russian media, and I'm very proud of the work that I do. But I'm only speaking from my own observations. I don't speak as a representative of Russia or anything like that. But based on what I have observed, it appears to me that there are a lot of folks in Russia that just want to be a normal country. They just want Russia to be a normal country. They want Russia to be able to trade on the international markets and do business. They want tourists from Russia to be able to come to the United States and vice versa. They want to have their economy function. They want to continue developing and having new businesses open up. They just want Russia to be a normal country. They're not the Soviet Union anymore. And they just want to be, like any other country in the world, like any other major country. The problem is Wall Street will not allow that. Wall Street doesn't want competition. When Russia was poor and starving in the 90s, Bill Clinton loved Boris Yeltsin. But when Putin came in and used, state control over natural gas and oil to stabilize the economy, and Russia's economy started growing again, and Putin then rebuilt the industrial sector and the industrial output, and now their farming sector has been rebuilt, largely subsidized by state oil and gas money. They're now having some of the biggest harvests in history. They're producing like the top amount of wheat of any country in the world. They've rebuilt their farming sector. Now Russia's a competitor again, and Wall Street doesn't want competition. And what's interesting is that there's a lot of, press in the media saying, oh, Russia is turning into the Soviet Union again. It's turning into an authoritarian military state. No, I mean, Russia does not want to be, a Soviet kind of country. It doesn't want to be a completely illiberal country. It wants to be a normal country. Wall Street won't allow it, and the sanctions have been put on them, and the threats from Ukraine have been put on them, and at this point, yes, I mean, Russia's becoming more militarized. Russia's, reviving some of that Russian patriotism and that pride in the Soviet Union and their defeat of the Nazis and Stalin and such, and Russia is kind of being forced to start to to function in ways that are more illiberal, I guess you could say, and are more reminiscent of the Soviet Union, but they're doing so very reluctantly. Again, a lot of the wealthiest people in Russian society would just like to be normal capitalists doing business on the international markets, but that won't be allowed. And in order to just kind of protect the right of a lot of Russian businessmen to do business internationally, you have to have a very, very strong state sector to back them up and protect them from the competition of American corporations and American capitalists who just want to go in there and loot the country and put them out of business.
I think another component to this conflict with Russia between the West is Russiagate. I sort of envisioning here a sort of like Glenn Beck style chalkboard with all these connecting dots. Putin's connected to Trump, and then Trump is connected to, RT, and then you're connected to somebody. And there's this whole web of everybody. Anybody that knows everybody, it's all Putin. He's the spider at the middle of the web. So first of all, what's your official position on Russiagate? And then second of all, to what extent do you think Russiagate has primed the American elites and the sort of like more urban liberal left for this war?
Well, Russiagate from the beginning was just a joke. I mean, there were so many premises that it was based on that were just ridiculous. I guess the idea is that somehow when WikiLeaks got its hands on Hillary Clinton's emails, that somehow that was done by Russia. That has never been proven, that Russia is the one that hacked those emails. But even if that were the case, right, and Russia gave Hillary Clinton's emails to Julian Assange, if that were the case, would that have changed the election results? Was there anybody who was like, well, I'm going to vote for Hillary? Oh, no, now I see the emails. I'm voting for Trump. I think it's very, very unlikely that would have changed the election results. I mean, people get into, Donald Trump, was he tied to this businessman or this businessman? And the more you look into it, there's just nothing there. The idea that Donald Trump was an agent of Putin or a puppet of Putin, that Russia rigged the elections to support Donald Trump, is just such a ridiculous hoax. It's not true. The way they presented it, they assume that most people will not dig into the actual facts, right? One phrase we heard a lot during the Russiagate stuff was Russia hacked the elections. Well, that implies that actual results were changed, right? That they hacked into the vote counting machine and changed it. No one has ever even alleged that. No one has ever alleged that. But yet they used that phrase to kind of subtly put into people's minds that that's what happened, right? And then they played up the idea that Putin was just like Trump, and Trump was soft on Putin. And then there was this whole thing about Hillary Clinton's emails, and the more you dig into it, there's nothing there. But it's just a narrative, just a drumbeat that they put out there. And a lot of it was psyching up liberals to have the idea that Russia's their enemy, that Russia's bad, and that being opposed to Russia was not a right-wing thing. It's not a Reagan-esque Cold War thing. It's a hip, liberal, progressive thing, fighting for women's rights, fighting for LGBT rights, or something like that. So it's taken a psychological toll, I would say. But if you just look at the facts, there's nothing there.
Now, this is the last question I'll ask you. Looking at how clearly documented the sort of prevarication and lies of the military-industrial complex has been to get us into war, how many people remember that the BBC and Reuters reported on the fact that the Taliban was going to offer Osama bin Laden to George W. Bush in order to avoid an invasion, which we said no? And then, in fact, the fake WMDs in Iraq. and then now all these trumped up charges with Russia. We can go all the way down the line and chart the last 20 years in minute detail. And all of this doesn't mean anything, it seems. So what does that make you? How do you look at that? Does that give you despair? Do you see there's a way to get around that? I mean, we have it all on the table.
Well, I think I've noticed in the past couple weeks that it seems like, especially in the last couple days, mainstream US media is almost preparing their audiences to be told that a huge amount of what they've been told about Ukraine and Russia is not true. When we have, they're admitting now that, this claim there was some kind of pending chemical attack from Putin. Okay, that never was going to happen. The intelligence never really showed that. You look into that and you have MSNBC saying, well, this is information warfare. And it's actually brilliant to have, Biden go out and say things that might not be true because we're getting ahead of Putin and we're getting ahead of Russia. And it's looking to me like, the fact that they won't even allow a UN meeting to happen regarding the Bucha massacre, and the allegation that Russia is responsible. Russia wants an opportunity to defend itself at the UN. They won't even grant it. And so many of these allegations against Russia are just falling apart. And it looks like to me, it's possible that in the next couple of weeks, there's going to start to be a thaw. That the United States is coming to realize, okay, we can't keep this going for long enough. Probably, if anything, just because Europe is not willing to keep going along with this for much longer. I think Biden and probably the British would like to keep this going as long as they possibly can. But I think there's a lot of weariness in Europe. The fact that Le Pen is doing so well in the French elections and maybe the next French president, that's pretty big. The gas prices go low globally. I think Europe is really kind of tired of this. And if Europe is not on board with this, it's going to fall apart like a house of cards. So I think I see mainstream U.S. media preparing the U.S. public to be informed that a lot of things are not true and to suddenly start kind of reversing the course of this. But we shall see. But the other thing is that I also see a lot of people leaving the mainstream platforms on Facebook. I mean, you can't watch RT on YouTube. I mean, you can't. I mean, they've taken it off, right? Twitter and Facebook and a lot of the tech, Silicon Valley monopolies are just playing such a blatantly partisan role that anyone who wants to look for any other side of the story is going to have to go elsewhere. And so I think that, again, in the long term, this can ultimately play into the favor of those of us who are critical of wars and U.S. foreign policy. Right now is the hard part. It's always darkest before dawn, as they say. So we just have to endure. We just have to hold the line and stick up for what we know to be true against the barrage of lies, deception, and largely just emotions. A lot of this is just emotions. I think that we're going to come out vindicated once again, just like we did with Libya, just like we did with Iraq. And the main thing is we need to not just have people that are on the internet cynical about this. We need to build actual communities. And that's what the Center for Political Innovation is about. It's about building a real community of solidarity of people that are committed to spreading an anti-imperialist message and winning people in the United States to a constructive, optimistic vision of socialism. We need to build real anti-imperialist political infrastructure in the United States. Just online cynicism and questioning of the lies is not really enough to really change the world.
So before we wrap up this discussion, is there anything you'd like to leave the audience with?
Well, I do want to say that, a lot of people have kind of said that because I said in this video, I made this video that went viral, I said Russia's not going to invade Ukraine. A lot of people take that and they say I'm completely discredited. But if you look at the facts, Russia did not intervene. Russia did not invade Ukraine. What happened was Russia was actually moving its troops away from the border, and then they recognized Donetsk, the Donetsk Republic and Donbass, and they moved in to protect them. And now we have mainstream media admitting that the bulk of the fighting that's happening in this war is happening in those two regions, Donetsk and Lugansk. And those are the two regions where the governments, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic have asked Russia to come in and protect them. So yes, Russia has engaged in some offensive operations against the Ukrainian military, but the bulk of the fighting is happening in the Donbass. And no, this is not just like a straight up invasion. So when people say I'm discredited by that, no, I'm not discredited, because if you look at the facts of what actually happened, Russia did everything possible to avoid moving into Ukraine. And they only moved in when they had the permission of two republics that they held off recognizing. For 8 years, Russia did not recognize the Donetsk People's Republic or the Lugansk People's Republic. They said, join Ukraine. They facilitated the Minsk Accords and the Minsk Agreement, and Ukraine was supposed to let the people of the Donbass region become part of Ukraine again. Let them speak their own language. Let them be integrated into Russian life, into Ukrainian life. But the Ukrainian government didn't do that. It bombed them, it shelled them, it subjected them to a food blockade. And in response to 8 years of that, when it became clear that the government in Kiev was going to move in on these folks with an offensive, at that point, Russia recognized these governments and then responded to their request for protection. So I don't think I've been discredited by saying that. Russia is reluctantly doing something they did not plan to do, but ultimately had to do in response to a pending massacre. So the folks who say that I'm discredited because of that, they don't know what they're talking about. But that won't stop them. And one thing, I mean, it's become apparently clear is no matter what you say, if you are standing up to these lies, they will come at you with anything. And that's the thing. These are the forces that, again, have been calling people Nazis for 8-9 years straight. And now all of a sudden they're supporting actual Nazis in Ukraine. So they're not concerned about what the truth is in any conceivable way.
Well, again, thank you, Caleb. It's always a pleasure.
Sure thing. Talk to you soon.
This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.